All right, we're going to start this afternoon with the conversation about rhyme and phonological awareness, which was sort of an issue for quite a few weeks, months, whatever. So I know that the ones in bold were the controversial items in the phonological awareness strategies. So I know that you have received the rationale that I wrote to try to merge this, the concerns. And I know some of you met yesterday and generated some questions. I don't have a list of that. I didn't print them out. So you probably know what they are, and if you have others. So I'm thinking that for this part, we will just work from your questions because you have the rationale from me and know what I think. So we'll open it up. Questions? Now this is going to be interesting if there are no questions. Oh, that would be great. Okay, sure. There were a couple of questions from yesterday. And actually, the first one, there was a question regarding phonological awareness activity involving compound words. Blending rain and bow gives you rainbow. Rain has meaning and bow has meaning. And when you combine the words, you have a new meaning. Is using pictures to represent rain and bow to segment or blend the word, confusing the goal. And I'm assuming here the goal is phonological awareness as opposed to meaning. The concern is that children may also be attending to the meaning of the words, making this a confusing example, particularly for English learners. And I'm not sure why it would be any more confusing for them as opposed to the others. Anyway, can you suggest a better way to scaffold the concept of segmenting and blending compound words? Great question. And this came up in feedback from someone who said you're using real words. You shouldn't use real words because phonological awareness is dealing with sound apart from meaning. So I had a conversation with David Dickinson, my good friend, who's the language person. And it was interesting to have that conversation. I said, what does it mean when we say that phonological awareness is the ability to deal with the sounds of words? I always say apart from their meaning. And he said, and I agree, that when we say set apart from meaning, we mean that we're not using language for communication when we do phonological awareness. So for example, maybe you've had this experience with rhyme production. So when I had done that years and years ago with, say, older 4-year-olds, or even kind of younger 4-year-olds, you'd say, okay, cake, can you think of words that rhyme with cake? And someone says, birthday, okay, all right. And I hear that in classrooms now. They're giving a meaningful link because they're expecting that we should make sense, so we would usually do with language. And you say, okay, well, that's not the kind of game we're playing. Here, it could be lake and rake because the last part has nothing to do with whether these things were. So I don't understand the set apart, apart from meaning part, as we can't use meaningful words. The words that mean all words have meaning. It would push us into the realm of using just nonsense words, which I think we should communicate to children. Nonsense words are fair game, and we shouldn't shut those down. I do see that in classrooms sometimes, to my dismay, in phonological awareness activities. Well, that's not a real word. It doesn't matter here. They got it, just generating. But on the other hand, using real words, whether for compound words that we blend or segment, it is not an issue. And that's not, I think, what was intended in this definition of focusing on sound apart from meaning. Simply means we are not using language to communicate here the way we usually communicate. And having said that, I always think about the initial phase of phonological awareness, no matter what the level of the linguistic unit. That initial phase, sort of communicating to the children that this is a whole different ballgame. We've used language for communication. That's what we use. That's what it's for. and then to start playing games with the sounds where we set meaning aside must seem very strange to children. What are you asking me to do? And then, of course, once they realize it's playful and what we're asking them to do, it becomes fun. But I think that first little foray into this area, part of what we get is, huh? What is this? Okay, you're asking me not to make sense and to connect words meaningfully. So I don't know if that helps in terms of answering that first question about whether it's okay or be confusing. I mean, I think it is confusing for children at first to understand that they are not to attend to the meaning, okay? That we are attending to the sound despite the meaning. And in this case, we've got two words put together that make, so I don't know whether this is any more problematic than other situations, but I don't know. Anybody have any other thoughts about what it means to set aside meaning? Yes?
I'm not sure about setting aside meaning. I think the problem about the compound words is real. But I think the piece about using meaningful words, one of the reasons why that is very helpful for children is because there's a memory load involved in phonological awareness.
Yes.
And so when you have to take a sound off a word, if you can't remember what that, like I said, yep, and tell you I just said something in Martian and I want you to take the first sound off, and you don't know that word because you can't. Hey, it's not fair. I can't remember the word.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So that for the English learners, the nature of those words being words that they're either very simple, likely to be familiar with, or are taught the meanings of, to actually help them remember what they're supposed to operate on.
Exactly.
Is why real words, but the compound words are a different matter. But just in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree, and I tucked into the rationale for phonological awareness in terms of the vocabulary issue, even when it comes to detection in situations where we give a target and then we say, I'm going to, and you have pictures, and I'm going to name these pictures, and you tell me which one starts with the same sound as, Even there, if I'm not familiar with those names, I can't hold on to those long enough to do anything with them. So, and the other thing about meaningful, about words in their vocabulary is back to the lexical restructuring theory of priming phonological awareness. We know that familiar words and words that have low, what we call AOA, age of acquisition, children perform better on phonological awareness tasks on those words than on unfamiliar words, or even words that are in their vocabulary but are high AOA. They haven't been in their vocabulary very long. Now, some people say, well, this fits very nicely with the lexical restructuring theory because words that have been in your vocabulary for quite a while are more likely to form some of the dense phonological neighborhoods. And that restructuring is not across the board. That restructuring, according to the theory, is within the dense phonological neighborhood. So we restructure these so the segmental features are stored. And then when I get another dense phonological neighborhood, that's restructured. So if that theory has any merit, and we don't know yet, I think it's so intriguing, I can't wait till my doctoral student gets her dissertation done. But we do know, I think there's a lot of evidence out there already that children will do better on phonological awareness tasks with familiar vocabulary words. So we shouldn't be backing away from words they know. We need to use those, in fact, and they will understand that we're not using these meaningfully to communicate. It doesn't take them too long to catch on to that. But that's a very good question, because I think that definition of phonological awareness is a little tricky if you don't interpret it as, you could interpret it as, but I don't know how you'd even do the task if we can't use real words at all. But it just means that we aren't communicating with language when we play these games. What programs? So I think there are lots of different ways to get at letter idea, but the underlying thing you have to do is consistent, thorough, lots of exposure. And in the dissertation I referred to earlier by Shane Piasta, she looked at all possible variables that have turned up in the research in terms of which letters are easier to learn first and which are harder. Letters early in the alphabet sequence tend to be learned earlier than ones that are later. The first letters in a child's name tend to be learned earlier. And then letters are not confusable. But what she found, the bottom line was there was so much variation that you could hardly come up with any formula if you wanted to devise a program of which ones to start with. She said it's very individual. Some kids like this letter and they don't like that one. But I think the bottom line is it's frequency of exposure with explicitness. And it doesn't really matter which letter you start with, or if you do 4 or 5 at a time. I don't think it matters. But we need more research in that area to sort some of this out. Okay, so that's the one about zoophonics. Number 3 was interesting. On page 6, it really sounds like children can rhyme and identify beginning sounds as long as the choices on assessment are less than 4. Where's the reference? Okay, this is a misinterpretation, I think, of what's there. It's a misinterpretation of rhyme because it's not asking for any production. Detection, we are giving them the words. If you are giving them the words to, if you, for example, say, I'm going to give you pairs of words, I'm going to say 2 words, and you tell me whether or not they rhyme. And so you give goat and coat, and you give bat and girl, or whatever you want. So some do rhyme and some don't. But the point is you're giving them the words. That's very different from what I understand as having kids rhyme, which is you generate the words, okay? So the detection tasks are very different from production tasks. Now, the point I had made about the detection tasks is that if you have too many items, it's back to what Teresa was saying is, first of all, I don't even know the names of some of those, so I've got problem number 1. But even if I did, you've got a target here and 3 pictures and 3 words here. Even if you do know the names, that's a lot to keep in mind. So if you decrease those to judgment pairs or a target in just 2, you've really decreased the cognitive load. And the research is Bradley and Bryant, and the book is University of Michigan, 1986, Rhyme and Reason, and there's the rest of it. Anyway, it was a beautiful study. And there were some articles also in terms of the place of rhyme and nursery rhymes in phonological awareness, and they followed children, I think, through 2nd grade. It was one of the first studies that really looked at phonological awareness in the very early years and answered the question, does it predict success in reading and writing? But they found, they had 4 and 5-year-olds, and they found that their initial detection tests, which had 4 or 5 items, I can't remember, that the 4-year-olds were at floor. They just couldn't do it. So they decreased the number of items. And their 4-year-olds actually did better than the 5-year-olds. So the item reduction really helps. And then Laura Justice, in some of her work, her intervention work, uses rhyme and beginning sound judgment tasks, just 2, for instruction. So I don't know whose question it was or if that helps to answer it, but it is not rhyme production we're talking about here. I need to go back and make sure that that's clear in that paragraph. I'll go back and check it. Okay, good. Okay. Number 4 is where is the home language addressed in this appendix? Is PA for home language addressed in the ELD section? I didn't address it. I think actually phonological awareness is one area that, well, let me see how I want to say this. See if you could just do some of that in the home language, because now, I mean, we really need to. We really need to do some of this in the home language because of the things I said before. The familiarity with the vocabulary makes it easier to do the phonological awareness task. And certainly you'll get nowhere with rhyme production or beginning sound production pulling from vocabulary stores if you're operating in a language where they don't have a vocabulary store. So, but having said that, if you stick with blending, where you're giving the segments and you're modeling that, you can do some things in English, but I think also you need to work on the English acquisition as hard as you can, as fast as you can. But I think phonological awareness in the home language will transfer. That's the other thing. And the studies I look at, and actually I'm looking at some studies that Patrick Proctor, who's at Boston College, he has looked at the effects on the language you were taught to read in. So in first grade, he's looking at children. I think the sample is quite national. I forget the cities. So if you were taught to read, say, in Spanish, and then you transferred into English gradually, and I think he's looking at fifth grade, what's the reading comprehension look like in fifth grade? And he's finding that there's a huge advantage to being taught to read in English as opposed to Spanish. But the other thing, he's looking at decoding skills, and he's looking at language comprehension skills. The decoding skills are great. That's not where the problem is. The decoding skills in the native Spanish speakers is great, and which means that applied to English, that's not where some of the issues are. So, but I do think there are some issues with phonological awareness in classrooms for children in English if the children don't have much English. So, but I didn't mention that because I think the ELD chapter really does address all these issues, and the idea is that that chapter and this one should really merge and be used together and inform one another. And those are the experts, the people who did the ELD chapter. So it's a great chapter. But I can't remember exactly what they say about this. I haven't looked at that chapter for a while. So, okay, and it seems like there might have been another question that's. You remember what that question was? There was one more question on a different email, but I can't remember that one. But maybe you have other questions about the rhyme. Yes.
You use the expression dense phonological neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Yes. He's asking dense phonological neighborhoods, what that means. And it's associated with this lexical restructuring theory. And the idea is, as our vocabulary increases in size, we are going to have clusters of words that in terms of their sounds overlap. And there are many words, obviously, that overlap by all but one phoneme. Okay? Many, many. But you don't get overlapping neighborhoods until you have a pretty large vocabulary. I mean, it takes a while. So that's what's meant. And then once you get one of those, your brain restructures. That's what the theory suggests. Your brain will restore those words in a dense phonological neighborhood and store them segmentally. And that's why those words are more accessible, apparently, to phonological analysis. The research in this area is very, very detailed, very complex. It's beautifully done to sort some things out, but it's quite complex. What my doctoral student is going to do is work with 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, and 5-year-olds. She's got a longitudinal cross-sectional study, and she's going to track increases in vocabulary and increases in phonological awareness to see what she gets in terms of, which if you get changes in vocabulary first as opposed to phonological awareness. Because we also know that aspects of phonological processing affect vocabulary acquisition. So we've got all that going on too. But then what she's going to do that no one has done in the research that has found these correlations between vocabulary and phonological awareness, they're working from lists of age of acquisition for words, and they use words that are low age of acquisition for their phonological awareness tasks, thinking children should do better on those than the high age of acquisition, and in fact that's what happens. But no one is testing any individual children to know how many of these words in both categories that are on the master list are actually in that child's vocabulary. So she's going to do some assessment to find out exactly which words from the low age of acquisition list and which words from the high age of acquisition list each individual child knows. So she can get a little more data on how this might fit together. So it'll take her about 12 months to do that dissertation. But it should be interesting. I think Chris Lonergan actually is doing some research in this area too, but I'm not sure exactly what his design is. But anyway, that helped? Okay. This has profound implications, actually, for phonological awareness. Right now, the dominant approach is through tasks, as you know. We segment, we blend, we engage children in tasks. And And we know that it's really tough with some children. I mean, set rhyme aside, it's really tough getting higher levels of phonological awareness in place. And with other children, it's so much easier. And there could be a lot of reasons why. But, you know, if it turns out that the lexical restructuring theory has some merit, then it would maybe indicate we should switch the balance and hit language and vocabulary extremely hard up to some threshold level, and then start on the phonological awareness tasks. But before that, maybe we're spinning our wheels and spending a lot of time that is not very productive with the children. But all these are open questions, but it really is an important area. It's a whole different view about phonological awareness, a whole different view about the basis for what that capacity is. So we need some really good research to sort all of it out. Okay, what else in terms of phonological awareness in general? Yes, Teresa.
Just to bring us back to harmony and love.
I never mind disagreement. I love
the part about the rhyme. You know, I've been writing and working with folks with English learners for a bit. So I love that. And what I really liked about all those documents that you sent us were how they demonstrated. You took the time to demonstrate for all of us the complexity of the thinking that children have to engage in to do these. And to understand that in a way it really is rocket science.
It is.
But when we're trying to think about how to do it in a classroom, you know, it's the litter.
Yeah, it is the litter.
And so I just think that, you know, that was very useful to see that and outline, and I know that those processes to help us appreciate
Yes.
what children really do have to master
Yes.
in all of this, and that it takes them and us time and patience.
Right. And I think it's really, I mean, I can't stress how important it is to understand the complexity and how really right, for all the right reasons, the people who worked on the foundations were. I mean, you could see that in the first part of my rationale is, let's make no mistake about this. We have been on the wrong track for so long. And I see projects, even early reading first projects, I do site visits for. And one of the areas you're supposed to probe with teachers and coaches is phonological awareness. And one of the questions is, so what's the sequence in which you do various tasks? And rhyme almost always is at the beginning of the sequence, meaning that they think that's easy. So this is a huge problem out there. I mean, you are way ahead. You are way ahead of the game in terms of the rest of the country, that you're aware of this and that came up in your foundations. I mean, I think, as you know from the rationale, that I think the line was drawn too narrowly. I think there are ways we can approach rhyme. It must be very explicit. We must get the rhyme detection within the number of items. So I think we can do some of it, but you better be careful in how you do it. And we cannot go back to the old way of being so general and sloppy, as I must admit I was. You know, who can think of other words that begin or that rhyme with code? And you know, you'd have two or three who could, you know, think, yes, that's right. No unpacking for the rest of the children, none. And we just can't do that. We can't do that anymore. So anyway, I was glad. I mean, it was a struggle in many ways, and there certainly were differences of opinion out there. And but it was really interesting and fun, actually, for me to try to sort it out and come up with some ways that we can do some rhyme, but we need to know what we're doing, because we're hurting kids if we don't. There's just no question. They don't know what's going on, and they can't learn from situations where they just don't know what's going on. So, but anyway, it's not on the burner in most places. I have a question for you, just in terms of current practice. What would you say the linguistic unit target is in most of the programs? I mean, is it syllable as a unit? Is it onset rhyme? Is it beginning? Is it phoneme? What currently is sort of the target for end of preschool, or I should say exposure, at least instruction, in your preschool programs right now? Probably don't know. What? Initial phoneme. And that would be, it would say single consonant onset. We're really talking onset rhyme. You're not talking about consonant blends where the first sound would in fact be phoneme level. Okay, all right. Any end of word phoneme? Target, okay, all right. Okay. What? Did you have something you wanted to say? Okay.
I see that work happening in preschool, so I don't think it's the primary focus.
Oh, I just want to know the excuse me, the sort of the range across the year from beginning to end. What you viewed as allergies here, the upper range. And just wondering also in terms of, let's take syllables versus onset rhyme, what's the balance of the emphasis in programs you see on those two units? Do you see syllable level continuing the whole year in some way or another? Yes. How many yeses? Okay. All right. I think that's an issue. Syllable segments are acoustically salient. In other words, they're real. They're really those little breaks. Onset rhymes, great research done by Rebecca Trayman, and the onset rhyme boundary is also somewhat perceptible acoustically. You know, it exists. We get to phonemes, or what we call co-articulated in spoken words. Those are not unique, salient units of sound. So it's really almost a cognitive overlay. We have to learn to think about them as if they're individual sounds. But I think the syllable unit, it's important to start with for the reason I mentioned earlier, that this is a whole new ballgame with language with children. Like, what are you asking me to do? Instead of using language to communicate. So we need chunks that are big enough that they can actually perceive to get us down this road of playing with sound. But past that, I suspect we shouldn't do too much more, because we're pulling children in the direction that's the opposite one we want to go. So the more time we spend on syllable segments, the more salient those are going to probably be to kids, as opposed to moving in the direction of onset rhyme, and I would even say some phoning segments. I think you have to scaffold that. In other words, you have to isolate in words. But exposure to phoneme level. And we really need some more research on this just to see what the capacity is. But I keep thinking of some of those old studies, Charles Reed's study, categorization of speech sounds in English, 1975 dissertation. He was the one that looked at invented spellings. And of course, invented spellings are phoneme-based, not conventional, but they are phoneme-based spellings. And he found those in young 4-year-olds, and that was the population in Cambridge, Massachusetts, middle class, upper middle class. And also, I must say, at the lab school, the same kind of population, it was not unusual to see invented spellings in young 4-year-olds. It was just common. And by the end of the 4-year-old year, almost all the children. I can't believe that it's out of reach for other children. I just, and that's a huge difference. To be at the onset rhyme sort of level at the end of pre-K, as opposed to sort of a beginning phoning level. Now, I don't mean being able to isolate every phoneme in a word, even short ones, but I mean, taking a stab at some middle sounds coded. So I think the exposure to a phoneme level, we need to kind of think about how much of that we want to expose in preschool. Because outside of the low-income population, children are there. A lot of them are there by the end of pre-K. They go into kindergarten pretty much phoneme level aware. So it's just something to think about what the balance is in a year. Okay. Anything else on phonological awareness? Okay. Why don't we go ahead to use of information texts.